Hello everyone and welcome back to chapter 13. Brian stood at the end of the long part of the L of the lake and watched the water, smelled the water, listened to the water, and was the water. A fish moved and his eyes moved sideways to see the ripples, but he did not move any other part of his body. I did not raise the bow or reach into his belt pouch for a fish arrow. It was not the right kind of fish, not a good fish food. The food fish stayed close in the shallows and did not roll the way but made quiver movements, small movements, food movements. The larger fish rolled and stayed deep and could not be taken. But that didn't matter. This morning, he was not looking for fish. Fish was like meat, and he was sick of them. He was looking for one of the foolish birds. He called them fool birds. And there was a flock that lived near the end of the long part of the lake. But something he did not understand had stopped him, and he stood breathing gently through his mouth to keep silent, letting his eyes and ears go out and do the work for him. It had happened before this way. Something had come to him from outside to warn him, and he had stopped. Once it had been the bear again. He had been taking the last of the raspberries, and something came inside and stopped him. And when he looked where his ears said to look, there was a female bear with cubs. He had taken two more steps. He would have become between the mother and her cubs, and that was a bad place to be, as it was the mother who had stood and faced him and made a low sound in her throat, and threatened and warned him. He paid attention to the feeling now, and he stood and waited patiently, knowing he was right and that something would come. Turn, smell, listen, feel, and then a small sound, and he looked up, and away from the lake he saw a wolf. It was halfway up the hill from the lake, standing with his head and shoulders sticking out from a small opening, looking down on him with wide yellow eyes. He had never seen a wolf, and the size threw him, not as big as a bear, but somehow seeming that large. The wolf claimed all that was below him as his own, took Brian as his own. Brian looked back and for a moment felt afraid because the wolf was so right. He knew Brian knew him and owned him and chose not to do anything to him. But the fear then moved away, and Brian knew the wolf for what it was, another part of the woods, another part of it. Brian relaxed the tension on the spear of his hand, settled the bow in his other hand from where it had started to come up. He knew the wolf now as the wolf knew him. The wolf watched him for another time, effortlessly, staring at each other. Brian nodded. He was not the same now. The Brian that stood and watched the wolf move away and nodded to them had completely changed. Time had come, time that he had measured and didn't care about. Time had come into his life, moved out, and left him different. In measured time, 47 days had passed since the crash. 42 days, he thought, since he had died and been born as the new Brian. When the plane had come and gone, it had put him down, gutted him, and dropped him and left him with nothing. The rest of the first day, he had gone down and down until dark. He had let the fire go out. He had forgotten to eat even an egg. He had let his brain take him down to where he was done, and he didn't even want to continue on, to where he wanted to die. He had settled into the gray funk, deeper and still deeper, until finally in the dark he had gone up on the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end it by cutting himself. Madness, a hissing madness that took his brain. There had been nothing for him then, and he tried to become nothing. It was impossible to continue on. With his eyes closed and his mind open, he lay on the rock through the night, lay and hated and wished for it to end, and thought the word cloud down through the night was awful. Over and over the word, wanting all the clouds to come down. But in the morning, he was still there on the side, and the sun came up, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the cuts on his arm and dried blood turning black, and he saw the blood and hated the blood and hated what he had done to himself. He was not the same. The plane passed, changing him. The disappointment cut hard down into him. He was not the same, and he never would be. Of course, he had made a lot of mistakes up till this day. He smiled now, walking up the lake shore after the wolves were gone, thinking of the early mistakes, the mistakes that came before he realized that he had to find new ways to keep going. He had made a new fire, which he now kept going using partially rotted wood because the punky wood would smolder for hours and still come back with fire. But that had been the extent of doing things right for a while. His first bow was a disaster too. He had sat a whole night and shaped the limbs carefully until the bow looked beautiful. Then he spent 2 days making arrows. The shafts were willow, straight, and with the bark peeled, and he fire hardened the points and split a couple of them to make forked points, as he had done with the spear. He had no feathers, so he just left them bare, figuring, for fish, they only had to travel a few inches. He had no string, and that threw him until he looked down at his tennis shoes. They had long laces, too, very long, and he found that one lace cut in half would take care of both shoes, and that left the other lace for a bowstring. All seemed to be going well until he tried a test shot. He put an arrow to the string, pulled it back into his cheek, pointed it at a pile of dirt, and at that precise instant the bow wood exploded in his hand, sending splinters and chips of wood into his face. 2 pieces actually stuck in his forehead, just above his eyes, and they had only been slightly lower. They would have blinded him. Too stiff, I guess, Brian thought. Mistakes. He wrote it down in his mental journal. He listed them to tell his father. He listed all the mistakes he had made. A new bow with slender limbs and more fluid, gentle pull, all he could think of to hit the fish. It was infuriating, trying again and again. He would pull the bow back, set the arrow just above the water, and when the fish was no more than an inch away, he would release the arrow, only to miss again. It seemed to him that the arrow had gone right through the fish again and again, but the fish didn't get hurt. Finally, after hours, he stuck the arrow down in the water, pulled the bow, and waited for a fish to come close. And while he was waiting, he noted that the water seemed to make the arrow bend or break in the middle. And here we go talking about science again. Of course, he had forgotten that water refracts. It bends the light. He had learned that somewhere, in some class. Maybe it was biology, or Miss Petoskey's class. He couldn't remember, but it did bend the light, and that meant the fish were not where they appeared to be. They were lower, just below, which meant he had to aim under them. He would not forget his first hit, not ever, a round-shaped fish with golden sides as gold as the sun, stopped in front of the arrow, and he aimed just beneath it, at the bottom edge of the fish, and released the arrow, and there was a bright flurry, a splash of gold in the water. He grabbed the arrow and raised it up, and the fish was on one end, wiggling against the blue sky. He held the fish up in the sky until it stopped wiggling, held it and looked up to the sky, and felt his throat tighten, swell, and fill with pride at what he had done. He had done food. With his bow, with an arrow fashioned by his own hands, he had done food, got food. He found a way to live. The bow had given him this, and he was so excited with the bow, the arrow, the fish, the hatchet, and the sky. He stood and walked from the water, holding the fish and arrow and bow against the sky, seeing them as they fit his arms, as they were part of him. He had food, fish food. He cut a green willow fork and held the fish over the fire until the skin crackled and peeled away, and the meat inside was flaky and moist and tender. This he picked off carefully with his fingers, tasting every piece, mashing them in his mouth with his tongue, just to get the juices out of them, hot, steaming pieces of fish. He could not, he thought then, ever get enough. And all that first day, that first new day, he spent going to the lake, shooting a fish, taking it back to the fire, cooking it and eating it, and then back to the lake, shooting a fish, cooking it, eating it, until it was dark. He had taken the scraps back to the water with the thought they might work for bait, and the other fish came by the hundreds to clean them up. He could take his pick of them like a store, he thought, just like a store. He could not remember later how many he ate that day, but it must have been over 20. It had been an absolute feast. By the end of the day, when it became dark, he lay next to the fire with his stomach full of fish. He had hope. Hope in the fact that he could learn and survive and take care of himself. Tough hope, he thought that night, but I am full of tough hope. And that was chapter 13.